reason for producing the Battlescapes book, which is subtitled The Impact of Terrain on War and Military Strategy, was to bring together the influence of landscape on wars and on conflicts and on individual battles, but also the impact of those conflicts and battles on the ecology and the landscape and the environmental resource. But we'd organised a very successful conference on war and peat, which is basically to do with peatlands and wetlands and warfare, and the often very surprising impact and importance of those landscapes in triggering conflicts or in the determination of conflicts. So we see in the Second World War, for example, the Dutch resistance flooding the polders, reflooding the drained polders to halt the Nazi advance. And then we also see the Nazis, in retaliation once they conquered Holland, flooding the farmland to starve the Dutch as a tit for tat. In our backyard here in Sheffield, we have the use of the peat bogs at Thorn and Hatfield Moors as a mainstay for producing litter, peat litter, that went to the Western Front in World War One and actually powered a lot of the conflict there. Because if you've got horses, and if you look at the book, there's images of men and machines and artillery. It's all transported until modern times by horsepower and manpower. If you've got horses, you've got to litter them, you've got to stable them. That was peat cut from Thorn Moors. So there's a direct link between our wetlands here and the conflict that went on in World War One. Wetlands also became, the peat bogs became the last resting place for pilots on both sides in World War Two, when planes crashed into Thorn Moors, and there are still war graves discovered, sometimes when the peat has been removed. Landscape, ecology, resources, humanity all thrown into one. Things like seasonality, which we get in the Ukraine conflict now, that in winter it's really, really cold, and that causes huge implications. I mentioned the seasonality because with the European arena in Central Europe through Ukraine into Russia, you get the catastrophically cold winters, but you also get the roads which, when wet, when the roads are dry, they're okay, they're passable. When they become wet, but not frozen, they're not passable, and the transport gets mired down. I've got loads and loads of photographs in here of people trying to take their guns through wet, muddy, miry situations, and it's just hellish. The Battle of the Somme is noted for the wet conditions. And I talked to historians, this is one of the triggers for the book. I talked to historians, they say, oh well, it was all the shelling that made it all. No, it's because it's in a great peat bog. That's why the battle is fought in a peat bog, and that's why it's wet, and the shelling actually makes it worse. It just stirs the whole thing up. Now, I've tried to get examples from around the world, so I look at the conflict in the Second World War in things like the Philippines and with the Japanese and the Americans again getting bogged down, and the Americans in Vietnam struggling against indigenous resistance, which, as I point out in the book, is always troubling. You very rarely win against indigenous fighters, because they interviewed some of the generals from the Viet Cong, and they just said, well, where do we go? We're fighting for our homeland, for our families, for our wives, our kids, our villages. We can't go home, we are home. So what do you expect? What was interesting was how military minds and military generals have actually used the landscape. So there's the impacts on the landscape, the removal of trees, of woodlands, of forests, but also how you use the landscape militarily to your advantage, or in some cases catastrophically to disadvantage. So you're trying to get into the minds of the people there, but to do that from a point of view of being informed about the environment, because most of the military histories are written by people who don't really understand landscape or the environment.